Thank y'all for being here. I know we're getting late in the evening. So I just wanted to start off by giving a few acknowledgments. Thank you, of course, to David Burhans and to Dr. Miller and the folks at the CCE. I also want to thank my incredible site supervisor, Karen, and everyone at the Science Museum, as well as my research mentor, Dr. Swice. They made this an incredible summer, and I'm really excited to share with y'all some of the research that I found throughout. About to find out if this clicker works, and it does. Fantastic. So this summer I was working at the Science Museum of Virginia at a special exhibit on Pompeii that they had. This exhibit had over 100 original artifacts as well as 2 plaster casts of bodies from Pompeii. Those 2 casts were the primary interest that I had in the exhibit because my research question was, how is the human body objectified and commodified in museum settings in the display? So as I said, I was at the Science Museum. The Science Museum is like 15 minutes from here. It's not far. It's on Broad Street. And they are a museum that is devoted to increasing the interest in sciences through hands-on learning and through engagement with the community. This summer they had the Pompeii exhibit, and they had those 2 casts. They had the 100 or so artifacts. And it seemed a little incongruous at first, like how does this connect to STEM? It's an exhibit on Pompeii, but the real focus of that exhibit was on the science of Rome and of Pompeii, the science of the ancient world. So in my job, I had sort of a behind-the-scenes responsibility and a front-of-house responsibility. So behind the scenes, for the first few weeks that I was working there and before the exhibit technically opened, I was creating an exhibition guide for museum staff. The staff are wonderful people who have a STEM focus, and some of the things that were necessary knowledge for the exhibit were more in the humanities sphere. So I was helping to educate museum staff on general history and culture of the ancient Roman world. Once the exhibit opened, I transitioned to a primary role in the actual exhibit space. The closest way to describe my role is probably as a student docent. So I was in the exhibit, educating guests, interacting with them, making sure they didn't try to touch anything. But my goal was to educate first the staff and then the members of the community who came to see the exhibit. So throughout the entire time I was there, I was participating in ethnographic research. I was taking field notes of what I did in the exhibit, what I did outside of the exhibit, engaging in participant observation, fully immersing myself. I also had the opportunity to interview a few assistant directors and the deputy director of the museum, which was an incredible opportunity to get some insight into how special exhibits work in the museum. So my main research finding is that the exhibit, which was titled Pompeii, the Immortal City, it reflected a desire to create this descendancy of the Western world from the Roman Empire. I found that shown through 3 ways: the construction of the exhibit, the descriptions of the Romans, and the education of the guests. So I'm going to take you through those 3 different ways. So here we're talking about exhibit construction. I wasn't actually able to see the exhibit until about 24 hours before it opened. No one was really, we weren't allowed back there. But the exhibit construction was extraordinary in what it revealed about the attitude of the exhibit. What you're seeing here is the final room. So this was a room where the actual casts of the bodies were located. You can see them right there. It had a very different color scheme from the rest of the exhibit. The rest of the exhibit was this sort of orange and gray color that sort of my primary PowerPoint or Prezi theme colors are. But then you would go down this black hallway and enter this room with this loud operatic Italian music. Light projected from the ceiling represented the ash falling on Pompeii. It was a dim room, and that really created this stark contrast from the rest of the exhibit that sort of signaled viewers like, this is important, this is different. So people ended up treating these casts, which were actually copies of the original casts, as though they were the actual bodies of people from Pompeii. They tended to whisper if they talked at all in the exhibit, and they tended to be much more respectful and quiet than they did in the rest of the exhibit. Additionally, the faces that you can kind of see in the background there, those are sort of gifts that would transition from a fresco of the image of somebody who could have lived in Pompeii to like a real moving person. So creating that connection, and some of those people who were in those projections were actually people who worked on the exhibit. So they were inserting themselves into the exhibit and taking on the role of Romans through being part of that exhibit. So here is some of two of the artifacts that we have in the exhibit, or had. It's moved on now, but these are 2 glass jars. So the description of the Romans in the exhibit is inherently connected to the Roman values, which they showed through the description of the Romans, and they really created a connection of Western values to Roman values. So there was a heavy STEM focus, like I mentioned, and in the United States and the Western world, science is a really valued part of the community. There was a lot of focus on the how and the what of the creation of artifacts. So there was a discussion of glass making, there was a discussion of metal forging, there was a discussion of Roman dining, but the people weren't necessarily involved. So we discussed Roman dining, but not necessarily Roman diners. And throughout that, you kind of see the creation of values that are inherent to us into the Roman world. When you think of Rome outside of this exhibit, you think luxury and decadence and feasts, and here we saw a much more down-to-earth, much more humble and frugal world of the Roman people. Finally, the education of the guests, of course, played a key role in the way that guests perceived the Romans. So throughout the exhibit, the focus, and this goes back to our mission of creating a relatable science atmosphere in the museum, but the focus of this exhibit was, how are the Romans just like us? So they have cranes like we do, they have jars like we do, look, they even have houses, and they have bodies like we do. So it was a really intense way to connect the viewer by telling them, like, we are just like them, we are them, in a way that was very powerful throughout the exhibit. So sort of the conclusion of my research is that this exhibit in the museum represented a way for guests to insert themselves into a historical narrative. They were not just viewing the Roman world, they were part of the Roman world. One of the theories that really centralized my research is the concept of the gaze. So the gaze was originally conceived to think about how doctors have an inherent power in the doctor-patient relationship, but it's spread far beyond that. So here we're seeing the inherent power of us as the now modern-day people representing an ancient culture, and we're able to look on this ancient culture and define it the way that we find to be the most fitting, as well as we are able to use that gaze to insert ourselves into the narrative. So when the people who created this exhibit made themselves part of the fresco, made themselves part of that image, they were inserting themselves into the gaze to be gazed upon as Romans, which forges an important cultural connection between us and creates a sort of common identity between our two cultures. I think that's all I have.